Chapter 10 Pageantry and Prizes. With the thundering of hooves, two knights galloped toward one another across the field. They met at the center, and a rain of wood splinters burst over them both. The knight in the blue livery raised his shattered lance, and the heralds cried out that he had been awarded a point. The ground was churned and muddy where the horses, and a dozen or so before them, had charged across the lists. Clods of dirt and grass scattered the field. Applause rang from the stands. The nobles, seated beneath the bright canopies, had been clapping and cheering for the past 2 hours with impressive stamina. Amira kept straight in her wooden throne, despite the trickle of sweat between her shoulder blades. The open stares of curiosity from the surrounding spectators had turned to occasional glances. Her whole life she had been shuffled into corners and the edges of rooms. Nearly overnight, she was now the center of attention. She felt their judgment burning all around her. The glances cast her way were unfriendly for the most part, as best she could tell. People had even found ways to judge Fawnra, perfect, sweet Fawnra, back in her father's court. But Amira was sure her sister would not have earned quite so many glares. The imperial box stood apart, draped in the banners and crests of the Fandulian house and the imperial seal. Wooden rails lined the sides to keep the rabble out. A canopy spanned overhead for shade, and besides the 3 thrones at the front and center, rows of benches served as places for attendants, dignitaries, and retainers. Vesha occupied a raised wooden replica of the imperial throne. Today, the empress styled a slim golden circlet and a dress of the finest aquamarine damask, belted with cord silk. Her onyx hair hung in a wavy cascade, daringly loose. Darrigan and several other Kadrahan guarded the empress's back. None moved or spoke, and Darrigan's eyes remained on their surroundings, but Amira never doubted for a second that he watched her every move. The older Kadrahan had seemed almost vulnerable with her when he had come to her rooms, but now he watched her like a hawk. He seemed to expect she might strike out at the empress at any moment. Did he think that was the only reason Dangerth had wanted an assassin? To clear his own path to the throne? Amira stole a glance past the empress to Dangerth. The archduke sat on Vesha's right, staring rigidly at the lists. Clenched jaw, fingers digging into the arms of his seat. He looked even more miserable than she felt. When she'd learned they would be watching a tourney today, Amira had hoped to see some highborn noble get knocked on his arse. But if the past 2 hours were any indication, such happenings were rare if they happened at all. The knights charged one another again, and the pattern repeated itself. The knight in blue was declared the winner, and elicited an even louder round of applause from the crowd. The victor rode off the lists with his shattered lance held high, dappled grey destrier snorting. Amira mulled over Vesha's chosen seating arrangement. Even the most banal details could be political statements. The empress had given Dangerth the lesser throne at her right, the fitting place for a crown archduke. Yet she had placed Amira on her left. That was a place given to an honored counselor, a favored courtier, or a second-born child. As the future archduchess, Amira's place should have been beside the archduke. She should have been on an unassuming chair, close enough to hold his hand and maybe ease some of the tension that rippled through his shoulders. By placing Amira where she had, Vesha was saying that the Kadrahan was a power in her own right. It made no more sense than anything else about these Imperials. Amira shifted when she noticed a baronet staring at her clothes. Vesha had suggested, which was a veneer for a command, that Amira wear this cream and gold gown. It had a fitted brocade bodice and long fitted sleeves. Though the straight collar rose halfway up her neck, the front had a daring neckline that plunged in a narrow part. Very little flesh showed, but it dipped down to almost level with her ribs, daring anyone not to look. Amira self-consciously shifted in her seat. She'd worn scandalous clothes back home, even reveled in it, but this somehow felt different. 2 more knights took up their places on either side of the field. Their horses snorted eagerly, and the pages gripped their bridles tight as the heralds announced the riders' names and ranks. At the mention of the left-hand knight's name, cheers broke from the stands. Amira watched as the 2 knights took their places, charged on the listmaster's signal, and missed one another. A disappointed groan went through the crowd. The knights went at it a second round, and this time a lance shattered. The point was awarded, and the heralds kept track of the score on the large wooden counting block. The victor of the match was declared, and another set of contenders moved on to the field. It seemed that narrowing down the contestants would take some time. One of the knights rode in on a chestnut destrier with vibrant green trappings, and another on a roan in burgundy. 2 pages gripped each of the prancing animals' bridles on either side, restraining the beasts best they could. Dangerth leaned forward with his first genuine show of interest that morning. "And now, my lords and ladies, your highness and your majesty," the herald boomed. It was a wonder he had kept his voice this long. "I present to you Sir Dolin Cares of Civilset, and Sir Thadred Morani of Dunharrow." Amira straightened along with the archduke. The crowd roared at Thadred's name, including a good number of women, who clearly didn't find him as annoying as she did. Thadred stood tall on his chestnut, looking impressively gallant, she had to admit. "Thadred still jousts?" "Of course. He couldn't keep himself off the lists if he tried," Dangerth answered, sipping from a wine goblet. "Even after his accident?" Dangerth shrugged. "My cousin is stronger than most." "I heard it almost killed him. That it should have killed him by all counts." Dangerth shrugged again. "As I said, stronger than most. He heals quickly." On the lists, the 2 knights took their places. The assassin watched curiously, searching for any sign that his limp hindered him. She could note no difference between Thadred's style to that of any of his competition. At the signal, the destriers barreled down the lists, 4,000 pounds of horseflesh and metal on a collision course. The lances leveled, the crowd gave a collective inhale, and Thadred's lance landed square on the shoulder of the other knight, sweeping him out of the saddle and flat on his backside. Everyone leapt to their feet, cheering and calling Thadred's name. It was an automatic victory. Dangerth's cousin dropped his splintered lance and raised his fist in the air, circling his horse around the lists at a canter. He basked in his victory for a full circuit before returning to his side of the ring and allowing the pages to help him out of the saddle. Meanwhile, Care's servants had the less dignified task of picking him up out of the dirt. They helped him stiffly to his feet and removed his helm, revealing a face sweaty and smudged with dirt. Cares made his way to Thadred's side of the arena, and the 2 shook hands as the next pair of riders took their place on the list. Amira kept her attention on Cares and Thadred as the 2 spoke together, occasionally motioning toward the list. They seemed on amicable terms, even if Dangerth's cousin had trounced the other night, then ridden in circles around him to prove it. "What do you think of Sir Thadred's performance, my lady?" It took Amira a moment to realize the empress had addressed her. The empress' tone was dry and unaffected. She might have been asking after the consistency of jerked beef. Amira hesitated a moment before answering. "It was spectacular, if short-lived. I hear that's what most women say of him. Vesha didn't quite smile, but mischief wrinkled the corners of her mouth. I wouldn't know. Amira clipped. Dangerth cleared his throat and stood. A small army of servants stood with him, including Talon, who had been seated a few chairs over. I will return shortly. Vesha nodded with a shooing gesture as the archduke crossed the practice field. Her eyes never left her son as he made his way to Thaddred. Almost of their own accord, Amira's eyes also followed Dangerth too. There was still another 2 hours of jousting. Then they would have to watch the finals for all the other events before the finals for the joust. It was a long time to wait for the chance to speak to him in private again. She needed to speak with him about their plans to get inside the palace vault. But even if they couldn't speak, she had to admit she preferred to have him close. She wasn't sure of much these days, but she was sure she could trust him. Vesha and the rest of the court, not so much. He was the one person she knew would protect her. Not even her parents had done that. Dangerth slapped his cousin on the back, and the two men laughed. They exchanged a few words, gesturing to the field. A female voice spoke from somewhere back in the stands. It must be the red hair. Men seem to prefer the red hair, even though my chore's waist is at least 2 inches smaller. The assassin frowned, the words barely audible over her shoulder. And my Huina has a dowry worth a king's ransom, muttered the same voice, rising a little. Amira cast a glance to her left, spotting a pale woman in a widow's tight black wimple. She might have looked like a prioress, if not for the headband of rubies across her forehead, and the rings that flashed on her knotted fingers. She spoke to a woman some years younger, though probably also a matron herself, dripping in sapphires with voluminous sleeves. The woman in sapphires sighed longingly. If only my Cressy had been a little older. I heard Count Delandro and Baron Alderman's daughters had a contest between them who could catch his highness first. As did every other virgin with a thimble of noble blood. Bah! The widow dropped her voice as she went on. This is madness. His highness has steered clear of every woman until now. The sapphire woman made a dismissive sound. In truth, she earned the crown for such a feat. I only wish she could teach my Cressy the trick. We might marry her off to one of the imperial cousins. Sir Thaddred? Heavens, no. I'll only accept a landed man for her, even if the archduke will no doubt give his cousin ample lands in time. One of us might still be able to secure the archduke. Now that we know he has interest in women, and don't give me that look. I know you wondered as sure as I did. Amira's jaw tightened. Even engaged or married, Dangerth would still be fair game to many of the noble houses. The family of an emperor, or great lord's mistress, was often as powerful as that of his wife. In the eastern parts of the empire, they even had a term for it, party wife, since the men often met their mistresses at parties and most often attended parties with them. But truly, Archduke Dangerth spurns every girl who comes his way, and then this red vixen gets him to sign a contract in less than a week. What was that, Marchioness? Vesha finally deigned to speak, though she had no doubt heard as much as Amira. The Empress's tone and countenance showed nothing but innocent curiosity. Did I hear my son's name? The woman in sapphires, the Marchioness, seemed to wilt beneath the Empress's scrutiny. Forgive me, your Imperial Majesty. We were just discussing the upcoming ball to celebrate the Archduke's betrothal. She inclined her head to Dangerth, who was still speaking with Thaddred across the field. Ah, Vesha responded with a vague smile. You must tell me if there is anything you wish to discuss. Yes, of course. The Marchioness ducked her head as her companion elbowed her ribs. Amira glowered at the two gossips as they scurried away. "Should I punish them for the insult?" Vesha asked. "How should I do it?" Again, it took Amira a moment to notice the Empress had spoken to her, though not as long as last time. "Your Majesty?" "They insulted the future Archduchess, the future Empress." Vesha leaned over the armrest, closer to Amira. "Shouldn't they be punished?" The younger woman forced herself not to cower. There was an authority and forcefulness about the Empress, a ferocity that simmered beneath the veneer of her beauty. Amira wasn't yet sure if the woman wanted to have her as a daughter-in-law or eat her alive. Amira found herself wishing that Dangerth would come back, and soon. "I'm no stranger to insults, Your Majesty." Amira returned her attention to the lists. "Haven't you ever wanted to repay them?" Vesha's tone was almost seductive as she leaned closer. Amira was convinced that whatever she said would be wrong, but she couldn't ignore the Empress. This woman might very well still have her beheaded. "Before we left Lashera, I repaid one of the people who had insulted me most." "Oh?" Amira raised her chin. "She deserved it, and worse. I still wish I could bash her brains in." Vesha made a satisfied sound, as if she had expected as much. "Shall I send for a stool?" Amira shifted uncomfortably. She should have known that the Empress would already know about Amira attacking her stepmother. "Let them be petty," the assassin said, though she could still feel the sting of their words. "Few of us can afford the luxury." Vesha made a considering sound and after a moment straightened, leaving Amira in peace on her side of the armrest. Dangerth returned across the practice field, with Talon and his other retainers in tow. He ascended the steps to the Imperial platform, glancing between his mother and Amira. "Is everything all right?" Amira shot him a sideways glance, then looked away. Vesha only smirked. "Of course, my son. Is your cousin sufficiently proud of himself?" Dangerth smiled. It was brief, and gone in an instant, but he did smile. It was a real smile, not donned for the sake of courtly decorum. "You know Thadred?" The Archduke took his place at his mother's side again. The lists were disassembled and rearranged by the orderlies. Straw bales with painted bull's eyes on the broadsides lined one side of the field. The stands stirred as some people left to find refreshments while some returned to watch. A large number congregated around a wager keep, identifiable by the plumed red feather in his cap. Men and women alike placed bets on the archers, signing their names on the wager keep's scroll. "Who do you wager will win the archery contest?" Vesha asked, eyes on the writhing stands. "Viscount Carespian," Dangerth answered without a moment's hesitation. "He always wins." "I don't think so," Vesha answered. "Oh? Where would you place your bets?" Dangerth smiled graciously in the direction of a bowing group of nobles passing before the stands, giving them permission to rise. The group then bowed to Vesha, and the Empress inclined her head with all the grace of a goddess. For one moment, she reminded Amira of a statue of Eponine that had been in the Istavari Tower. Graceful, kind, and yet teeming with power. It took Amira a moment to realize the third bow was directed at her. She fought to hide her surprise and copy the slight bow and wafture to release the nobles. The group rose and then scurried past. An older man with a woman perhaps in her 40s, with a pimpled boy and a girl that couldn't be more than 16. They were hemmed in by 2 ladies' maids, a valet, and a trio of backmen, domestic servants who often doubled as bodyguards. "That was Baron Alderman, his daughter Dempsia, and her 2 children," Vesha said, returning her attention to where the servants had almost finished setting up the archery field. "A minor house. Minor enough to know their place, yet still important enough to be useful from time to time." In her father's court, Amira had spent a lifetime learning every name, face, and likely motive that frequented the halls at Lashera. Here, she was starting over with perhaps 3 times as many faces and the stakes twice as high. "He's Rabiku's man," Vesha added. "So don't let his family's flattery get to you." Amira inhaled. She was used to being friendless. "You really think Rabiku would come against Amira?" Dangerth watched the aldermans scuttle away like puffs of velvet and silk. "Of course," Vesha said. "They'll do whatever they can to make her lose your favor." Amira ground her teeth. It wasn't like she'd asked for this. Quite the opposite. How many of them would still want to foist their daughters off on Dangerth if they knew about Ka'is? In truth, most of them would probably only care about Ka'is as far as it allowed them to manipulate the game. Like her father, every one of them had minor lords at home who depended on them, courted their favor, and made demands of them. Every one of these great lords no doubt also had 10 or 15 lesser lords in that number who would gladly replace them the moment their houses were weak enough. Power was like climbing a mountain. The higher you ascended, the farther you could fall, and the more people began wishing for you to fall. The trick was to tie as many people to you as possible, so that if you did fall, you would take them down with you. That, in principle, made those people watch out for your best interests. At last, the field was ready, and the herald called for the archers to take their positions for the final round of archery. The herald went through the roster, naming off the contestants and their scores from earlier that day, which Amira had missed. She and Dangerth had attended a mid-morning tea hosted by Dowager Duchess Elkin, a distant relative of the archduke. "Make ready!" the herald cried. The archers drew their bowstrings, leveling their arrows at the straw targets. "Loose!" 10 missiles streaked toward their straw destinations. 1 missed altogether, 3 hit the edge of their targets, 2 hit near the 3rd ring, 2 struck the 2nd ring, and only 1 struck the center. That would earn them a negative point, 1 point each, 3 points each, 5 points, 7 points, and 10 points, respectively, if she remembered the scoring system correctly. A moment later, the pages adjusted the score with the new tally, and it proved that she was correct. 10 points to the archer who had led the preliminaries. That gave him a tally of 62 for the final round, putting him more than 10 points ahead of the closest contender. "And the victor is His Grace, Viscount Carespian." The herald sprang onto the field and grasped the hand of the archer who had struck closest to the center, and had been the most accurate thus far, and thrust it toward the sky. A whoop rose from the stands as a train of gamblers made their way to the bookies. It seemed Carespian had been a popular bet. The Viscount beamed with victory, and the first heartfelt cheers erupted from the crowd. Several called his name in congratulations, and he was motioned toward the imperial box. Vesha rose, and the whole of the stands rose with her. Amira took her cue from Dangerth and stood as the empress descended the front steps of the imperial box. Vesha's embroidered train trailed after her, and Darrigan followed close behind, matching step for step. Viscount Carespian knelt before the empress. A page carrying a golden crown on a velvet pillow stepped up beside Vesha. It was a work of exquisite craftsmanship. Amira thought it held an uncanny resemblance to the one Dangerth wore now. The page kept his head down, avoiding the empress's gaze. Amira had only seen one person meet Vesha's eyes without hesitation. Darrigan. Vesha looked to the gold crown. Soon, it would be Amira's task to crown winners at events such as this, but for now, the job fell to Vesha. The stands, those occupying the imperial box, and every spectator waited. The Empress raised her chin. It seems to me that not all our contestants have yet shown their skill. Several murmurs went through the crowd. Amira looked to Dangerth, but the Archduke was frowning at Vesha. Lady Amira. The Empress beckoned over her shoulder. A cold dread spread throughout Amira's body at the sound of her name on the Empress's lips. Mother. Dangerth's voice was low, threatening. What are you doing? Come here, Amira, Vesha repeated, not looking away from the lists before them. Leave her alone. Dangerth growled. She is not your toy. Is there a reason you don't trust me, my son? Amira touched Dangerth's arm before stepping down the steps to the Empress's level. She needed the Empress as an ally no matter what happened. She wouldn't make an ally with defiance, and she didn't want Dangerth at odds with his mother over this. Come, darling. Vesha rested a hand on Amira's shoulder, drawing her nearer like a daughter. Darrigan's hand tightened on his sword hilt, but there was no other sign he even cared that a known assassin stood beside his liege lady. Lady Amira, won't you have your round? Vesha asked. 62. That's the score to beat. Viscount Carespian and the herald behind him looked on in bewilderment. Your Majesty? The court, the city, and indeed the Empire are all abuzz with rumors about the Archduke's young bride-to-be. They're curious. Vesha flashed her a smile. As am I. Don't you think we should get to know you better? The herald kept looking from Amira to Vesha to the Viscount for some explanation of what in Moraine's dread march was happening. Vesha smiled. A flash of teeth, like a snake before it strikes. Take the Viscount's bow and show us who you really are. Amira looked to the longbow still in the Viscount's clenched fist. It was a fine weapon, made of northern maple and sanded smooth. As she took his bow, the Viscount released it one finger at a time. But he could no more defy the Empress's wishes than Amira could defy Dangerth, not if he wished to keep his family in good graces at court. The Empress nudged Amira toward the archery field. The arrows had been collected from the targets, but the straw bales themselves remained. Orderlies, retainers, courtiers, and the untitled onlookers on the lower green stared slack-jawed as the Archduke's mysterious fiancé stepped onto the green. Amira had heard from Fonra that archery was a popular pastime among many gentlewomen in Menadra and the Empire. But women rarely entered contests outside the far southern kingdoms, where they also hunted and sometimes rode to war with men. Amira stole a look at Dangerth. The Archduke shook his head once. Don't. Dangerth cut himself off. I don't want you to do this. Amira paused. He'd been about to command her and then stopped himself. A request, not a command. He'd given her a choice. Choices. That was a new feeling. She could choose to hang back, cowering from the court and shrinking from exposure, or she could show them all what they were dealing with. Then there was Vesha. She needed to show Vesha she wasn't going to back down. In this case, defiance would show her as weak. Amira stared at Dangerth for a heartbeat, just a heartbeat, and made up her mind. She turned and marched to the distance marker before the first target. And now, the herald stammered, my lords and ladies, I give you Her Ladyship Amira Brindonu, betrothed of His Imperial Highness Archduke Dangerth. The announcement was met with hesitant clapping and more whispers. Amira looked over her shoulder a final time. An aide she didn't recognize whispered frantically to the Empress. Dangerth's face was white and pinched, and he looked ready to scream. She would apologize to him later. Passing one of the contestants still on the field, she yanked a fistful of arrows from his quiver. No one spoke above a whisper as she barreled to the targets. Amira took up a position at the first target, at the 100 paces marker. She knocked an arrow, drew her arm back, and loosed. The string twanged against her forearm. Even through her sleeve, it stung painfully. Amira gritted her teeth as the arrow buried itself within the target's third ring. It wasn't a perfect shot, but it would have killed. The herald announced the score a heartbeat late. 5 points to her ladyship. Polite clapping scattered the field, drowned out by the murmurs of the crowd. Amira was grateful that down here she couldn't make out their words. Knocking a second arrow, Amira strode to the second target and repeated the action with a fluid motion. The string slapped against her forearm a second time, and once again the arrow planted itself within the third ring. Her arm throbbed, and a spot of red blood stained her sleeve. Nothing she could do about it at the moment. Another 5 points. Amira moved to the third target, and this time the arrow landed within the fourth ring, buried at the edge of the bullseye. 10 points. She carried out the task with a hard, martial efficiency. By the time the fourth arrow buried itself in the center of the bullseye, her arm throbbed, and an angry red mark welled on her sleeve. Amira inhaled a deep breath, ignoring the throbbing in her forearm. The assassin moved on. As she struck her arrows within the second ring on the 5th and 6th times, the crowd hushed. When she approached the 7th target, something changed. Her heartbeat steadied. Her breathing fell into an easy rhythm. She'd been taught to regulate both, but as she pulled back the bowstring, she relaxed. The creak and curve of the bow, every flaw and foible in the wood, flared into her awareness. The wind became almost visible, a translucent ripple across the distance. Amira let loose, and the arrow hit the bullseye. Pain shot up her arm, but she moved on without so much as a flinch. The same preternatural awareness flooded her senses at the 8th, 9th, and the 10th targets. Thud, thud, thud. The arrows struck center. Amira barely believed it herself. Even at the height of her practice, she had never been this good. Her left arm burned sore. A bloody red stain marred her pale sleeve. 74, called the herald. 74 points to Lady Amira. A slow, rhythmic clap came from behind her. Amira turned to see the empress, watching her with a wry grin, hard to interpret at this distance. The crowd joined in, hesitant at first, and then louder. Amira looked up into the stands to see the woman in rubies along with the marchioness, applauding with everyone else. The assassin made her way back to the empress, brushing past the other archers. She supposed they were her opponents. The clapping rang out around her like the very voice of falsity. Viscount Carespian gaped at Amira with a mixture of fury and shock. She had just humiliated him and stolen his moment. Amira bowed to Vesha before returning the Viscount's bow to him. "It's a good weapon. Thank you for lending it to me," she said, using the words her tutors had always used when borrowing weapons for a demonstration during lessons. "Herald?" the Empress prompted. The narrow, pale man goggled Amira as the applause died down. My lords and ladies." He regained his composure, and his trained voice once again reverberated over the stands. "I present to you our victor, her ladyship Amira Brindonu." The herald did not take Amira's hand and make a show of presenting her as the winner, as he had done for the other winners. He stayed at a good distance, as was befitting for a noble lady. Vesha motioned to the ground before her. Amira knelt as the Viscount had done. She bowed, keenly aware that Darrigan was 2 steps behind the Empress, sword already in hand, ready to draw it. Vesha settled the golden circlet around the assassin's brow, taking her time, like she wanted to study the moment. "Rise, Victor." Amira stood, looking to Dangerth. The archduke looked on, his expression unreadable. "Now then." The empress folded her hands before her. "Let us refresh ourselves, and make ready for the next event." Amira waited until Her Majesty turned to speak with one of the ladies-in-waiting. The moment the empress was occupied, Amira went straight for Dangerth. They nearly collided in their haste to reach one another. Amira's circlet knocked askew, and she half-knowingly straightened it. Nobles rose to exchange pleasantries, circulating carefully. Their words were frivolous, questions about hunting dogs, new bolts of fabric from across the sea, and opinions on the new lace cravats that were this year's fashion. Yet Amira had been in her father's court enough to see that their benign interactions were anything but. These light, often brief conversations were a way to remind the other nobles you existed, that you were their friend, wanted to be, or had best be. Aramea's dozens of provinces and territories were represented in the press of clothes and faces. When so much of the court was only in residence seasonally, or every few years, grudges could spring from a single snub, or marriages from a single smile. A man and a woman from the far south stopped to give Dangerth their compliments. Amira didn't hear their names over the hubbub, but it sounded to her as if it were a father and daughter. No sooner had the southerners moved aside than Amira found herself facing a trio of the sea wardens. Their braided beards clinked with metal rings, and one man's beard reached below his belt. The man with the largest beard was a great thane, similar to a king, but not quite. As the sea wardens moved on and a bejeweled woman flanked by two somewhat pretty girls took their place, Amira realized that she and Dangerth were holding court, after a fashion. This was the first official outing of Dangerth's wife-to-be, their future empress. Everyone wanted to know what sort of woman would hold the White Throne when Dangerth was made emperor. Would she influence him for conquest? For peace? Would she favor any lands over others? Did she have prejudices or fondnesses that could be leveraged? This empire knew better than to underestimate a woman. Their foreign empress had taught them that. Servants appeared bearing wine flasks and platters of fruit and cheese. Many of the nobles drifted over to take advantage. A lull in the line of well-wishers finally came, and Dangerth wasted no time in pulling Amira into a corner, half hiding them both behind a long tapestry. Not enough to be improper, but enough to make it rude to disturb them. "Why did your mother do that?" Amira demanded the moment they had some semblance of privacy. "I was hoping you could tell me." Amira shook her head. Dangerth's gaze slid up to the circlet crowning Amira's brow at the same time she looked to his. They were nearly identical, but his had been studded in sapphires, while hers was adorned with rubies. It hardly seemed the sort of thing given out for an archery match, even if at the imperial palace. "She made you earn your crown," Dangerth said, frowning as if the words tasted strange. "She knew you'd win, but—" Dangerth rested a hand on the wooden rail of the box, turning his back to where his mother now sipped a goblet of wine, speaking to the sea wardens. "She's up to some game." Amira felt like a fly, caught up in the Empress's web. Whose side is she on? She wasn't even sure whose side she herself was on, so perhaps it was an unfair question. "The Empire's." "What does that mean?" Amira looked away from the Empress when she noticed several sets of eyes had noticed her staring, Darrigan in particular. "When can we leave?" Amira cleared her throat and smiled even as she said it. "We still have the finals for the discus throw, the sword fighting and the pole-arm fighting, then the joust at the very end." Amira suppressed a groan. She would rather hike a mountain barefoot. Dangerth's fingers brushed her left forearm.
You're hurt.
It's fine. Amira pulled back, though her skin throbbed hot and tender beneath her sleeve.
You're bleeding.
The assassin looked down to find the stain on her arm now covered most of the inside of her sleeve. Damn it!
Fetch the surgeon.
Dangerth ordered a footman in earshot. I don't need a surgeon, Amira protested.
I'd be a poor husband if I let you bleed all over your clothes.
Dangerth touched her left arm.
You should have asked for an arm guard.
I wanted to make a point.
Which is?
Amira tilted her chin up. I've faced worse. She reached for the laces at her shoulders.
Here, help me take my sleeve off.
Dangerth cleared his throat awkwardly, but obeyed, helping her undo the laces and pull off the brocade. As soon as he did, he exposed a bloody mark that had mostly stopped weeping, but still left a red smear over her skin.
Amira.
Dangerth stiffened.
Your arm.
At first, she thought he was looking at the welt, but then she realized his eyes were fixed on a place farther up her arm. She resisted the urge to cower self-consciously. White lines slashed across the inside of her elbow. Time had left her skin smooth and whole, but there was no mistaking the scars.
Who did this?
He gently brushed his thumb over the marks. A shiver went down her spine, his touch so tender it almost hurt. No one ever treated her with tenderness before. Not like this.
You don't have to tell me if you don't want to,
he added softly. Amira studied the man in front of her, the one who had a monster inside his skull, yet fought it for more than half his life. The one who held her leash so loosely she often forgot it was there. He hadn't wanted her to step onto the green, but had let it be her choice. Nor was he angry she'd chosen what he didn't want. He had earned an answer, she supposed, even if speaking the words made her feel naked. My grandmother, she said, and her acolytes. Dangerth froze, tension sending an invisible ramrod through his spine.
Why?
She didn't want my father to have me. Amira's mother, grandmother, and their people had already been declared traitors by then. The last thing they wanted was a young, malleable Istavari falling into the hands of a man who had sworn allegiance to their enemies. In a way, their worst fears had come true. King Hyle had weaponized her power for himself, paid to have her trained as one might a hunting dog. Dangerth's brow furrowed, but he never took his attention off her scars and the weeping splotch on her arm.
How old were you?
The question was soft, barely audible. 4, Amira answered. Dangerth stroked his thumb across her scars. His touch sent warm shivers up her arms and down her spine. He touched her so gently, caringly. She didn't want him to stop. The lines on Dangerth's forehead deepened. People were no doubt noticing the archduke's concern, but his attention was focused solely on those white lines. Don't pity me, Amira said. Please. She couldn't stop the waver that crept into the last word.
Not pity,
Dangerth said. The archduke took a breath and looked about to speak, then must have thought better of it.
But I'm sorry, he said, for what they did.
It was a long time ago, Amira said, straightening. Dangerth said nothing. He leaned down and pressed a kiss over the scars. It was a feather-soft caress, but she felt it in every nerve ending in her body like sparks of fire.
I'm sorry,
he whispered. He kissed the scars again, lips brushing over the sensitive skin inside her elbow. Dangerth. Amira barely managed to choke out his name. He straightened and searched her face, concern lining his own. The concern left as he studied her closer, her lips parted slightly, leaning toward him. Dangerth's eyes darkened.
Amira.
A woman with close-cropped hair and a tourney surgeon's uniform interrupted. Your Majesty, your Ladyship? The surgeon bowed to them each in turn. How can I be of service? Amira cleared her throat and turned away from the archduke. As the other woman began ministrations on her arm, her mind drifted to the approaching wedding, and specifically the wedding night. For the first time, she looked forward to it.